These people had everything: private jets, mega yachts, magazine covers, billions in the bank, celebrated as geniuses by everyone around them. Then, in what felt like an instant, it was all gone. Not bad luck, not market forces, fraud, hubris, and in some cases both. These are the biggest billionaire collapses in history. Elizabeth Holmes. Elizabeth Holmes founded Theranos in 2003 at 19 years old with a vision that would have genuinely changed medicine forever. A single drop of blood, hundreds of tests, results in hours instead of days. No needles, no labs. Revolutionary. The problem was, it did not work. The technology Theranos claimed to have developed never actually functioned as advertised. Blood tests were secretly being run on conventional third-party machines, while Holmes told investors, partners, and patients that her proprietary Edison device was performing them. Patients received inaccurate results for serious medical conditions, including cancer and HIV. Real people made real medical decisions based on fabricated data. Holmes raised nearly $1 billion from some of the most sophisticated investors in the world. She appeared on the covers of Fortune, Forbes, and Time. She was called the next Steve Jobs. She wore a black turtleneck to make the comparison more explicit. At its peak, Theranos was valued at $9 billion, and Holmes was worth an estimated $4.5 billion on paper. Then, in 2015, Wall Street Journal investigative reporter John Carreyrou began publishing findings that the technology did not work. The edifice collapsed. The SEC charged Holmes with fraud. A criminal trial followed. In 2022, Holmes was convicted on 4 counts of fraud and conspiracy. She was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. The $9 billion valuation became zero. The $4.5 billion net worth became nothing, and the patients who received false test results were left to reckon with the medical consequences of trusting a machine that never worked. Vijay Mallya. Vijay Mallya was the king of good times. That was literally his self-chosen title and the name of his beer brand Kingfisher, which he built into one of India's most recognizable consumer brands. He owned an Indian Premier League cricket team. He owned a Formula One racing team. He owned a fleet of private jets. He hosted legendary parties that became famous across India and beyond. He was the face of Indian extravagance and success. He also owned Kingfisher Airlines, which he launched in 2005 as a premium carrier designed to bring luxury air travel to India. The airline burned through money at extraordinary rates. By 2012, it had accumulated losses exceeding $1 billion. Employees went unpaid for months. Aircraft were grounded. The airline's operating license was suspended. Mallya owed approximately $1.3 billion to a consortium of Indian banks. Rather than face the consequences, he fled India in March 2016, traveling to the United Kingdom before Indian authorities could prevent his departure. He has been fighting extradition from the United Kingdom to India ever since on fraud and money laundering charges. His assets have been seized. His empire has been dismantled. The man who called himself the king of good times now lives in legal limbo in Britain, while Indian courts have declared him a fugitive economic offender. A.K. Batista. In 2012, A.K. Batista was the 8th richest person on Earth with a net worth of $30 billion. He was the wealthiest person in Latin American history. He was Brazil's golden boy, a symbol of the country's emergence as a global economic power. He was also making promises he could not keep. Batista built his empire on a series of companies in oil, mining, ports, and energy, all prefixed with the letter X: OGX for oil, MMX for mining, LLX for logistics. Each company promised extraordinary future returns based on projected resource discoveries and production targets that Batista presented with supreme confidence. OGX was the centerpiece. Batista promised investors it would become one of the largest oil producers in the Western Hemisphere based on offshore reserves he claimed his team had identified. International investors poured billions into OGX stock. The reserves were not what Batista had claimed. Production targets were missed dramatically and repeatedly. In October 2013, OGX filed for bankruptcy protection in what was at the time the largest corporate bankruptcy in Latin American history. The stock that had traded at nearly $3 per share fell to fractions of a cent. Batista's $30 billion fortune did not just shrink, it went negative. He ended up personally in debt by approximately $1 billion. The man who had been the 8th richest person on Earth became technically poorer than someone with nothing. Bernie Ebbers. Bernie Ebbers was a former milkman and basketball coach who somehow became the CEO of WorldCom and built it into the second largest long-distance telephone company in the United States through an aggressive acquisition strategy that eventually consumed over 60 companies. At its peak, WorldCom was worth $180 billion. Ebbers and his CFO, Scott Sullivan, orchestrated one of the largest accounting frauds in American history, hiding approximately $11 billion in expenses by improperly classifying them as capital investments. This made the company appear far more profitable than it actually was, allowing the stock price to remain artificially elevated. When the fraud was discovered in 2002, WorldCom filed for bankruptcy protection in what was at that point the largest bankruptcy in American history. $180 billion in market value evaporated. Tens of thousands of employees lost their jobs and their pension savings simultaneously. Ebbers was convicted of fraud and conspiracy and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. He died in prison in 2020. Adam Neumann and WeWork. Adam Neumann convinced some of the smartest investors in the world that a company that rented office space was actually a technology company worth $47 billion. WeWork's business model was straightforward: lease office buildings long-term, subdivide them into smaller flexible workspaces, and rent those spaces to individuals and companies at a premium. It was a real estate business with good branding and a charismatic founder. Neumann was extraordinary at selling a vision. He talked about elevating the world's consciousness. He declared WeWork was not just a workspace company, but a physical social network. He convinced SoftBank to invest nearly $10 billion. He convinced other sophisticated institutional investors to follow. The $47 billion valuation was accepted as real by serious people. When WeWork attempted to go public in 2019, the IPO prospectus was released publicly for the first time. Analysts immediately identified that WeWork was losing approximately $2 for every $1 of revenue it generated. The governance was described as chaotic. Neumann had taken hundreds of millions of dollars out of the company for himself, including charging WeWork $5.9 million for the trademark rights to the word we. The IPO collapsed. The valuation fell from $47 billion to below $10 billion almost overnight. SoftBank, which had led the investment, was forced to bail out the company at enormous loss. Neumann was pushed out as CEO. WeWork eventually went public at a valuation of $9 billion. It filed for bankruptcy in 2023. Sam Bankman-Fried. In early 2022, Sam Bankman-Fried had a net worth estimated at $26 billion, making him one of the wealthiest people in the world under 30. He was on magazine covers. He testified before Congress. He donated hundreds of millions to political campaigns. He was positioned as the responsible face of crypto. By November 2022, his net worth was effectively zero. FTX collapsed in days. $8 billion in customer funds were gone. The companies he controlled filed for bankruptcy simultaneously. The penthouse in the Bahamas, the private jets, the political influence. All gone. He was arrested, extradited, tried, and convicted on 7 counts of fraud and conspiracy. In March 2024, he was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. $26 billion to zero to prison in less than 12 months. The pattern. Holmes built a medical empire on technology that never worked. Malia built an airline empire on money he never had. Batista built an oil empire on reserves that never materialized. Ebbers built a telecom empire on accounting that was never real. Neumann built a real estate empire on a valuation that was never justified. Bankman-Fried built a crypto empire on customer funds that were never his. The pattern is not incompetence. Every single person on this list was genuinely brilliant at one specific thing, convincing sophisticated people to believe in something that was not real. The fraud was not in the product. The fraud was in the story. And the story worked until it did not. Closing. Every one of these collapses followed the same arc. A compelling vision, a charismatic founder, sophisticated investors who wanted to believe, warning signs dismissed or ignored. Then, a moment of exposure followed by a collapse so fast it seemed impossible. The billions were never really there. They existed in valuations, projections, and fabricated numbers that sophisticated people accepted because the story was good enough and the founder was convincing enough. Understanding how intelligent people get fooled by compelling stories is not just financial education, It is essential protection in a world where the next Elizabeth Holmes or Sam Bankman-Fried is already raising money somewhere right now. That is what Capital Code is here to expose every single week. Subscribe and watch the Ponzi scheme video to see how this pattern has been repeating for over a century. See you in the next one.